wasn't supposed to come home that early. The house was silent until he heard laughter from the study. As he stepped inside, what he saw froze him in place. His son, sitting by the fire, being taught by someone he never expected, his maid. But it wasn't the lesson that shocked him. It was how she taught. The confidence in her voice, the brilliance in her mind, and the truth in her words that no expensive tutor had ever spoken. What started as a simple math lesson would soon expose something far deeper. About privilege, power, and the walls they all pretended didn't exist. And if you believe every story deserves to be heard, hit subscribe and stay with us till the end, because this one will change how you see the world. It had been another cold winter morning in the Langford mansion, a place where silence carried more weight than words. Mr. Jonathan Langford, a billionaire known for his empire of luxury hotels, had flown back unexpectedly from a business trip. His staff wasn't prepared, and neither was his family. In that grand house of glass and gold, every sound mattered. The ticking clock, the faint hum of the fireplace, the quiet footsteps on marble floors. But on this day there was something else, the soft laughter of a child echoing through the hall. Curious, Jonathan followed it to the study. Inside sat his son Ethan, only 8 years old, staring at a whiteboard with full attention. And beside him stood Grace, the maid he barely noticed. She wore her usual navy uniform, but something about her presence was different now. She wasn't cleaning, she wasn't serving, she was teaching. Her voice was calm yet commanding, her eyes focused as she explained equations with a kind of passion that didn't belong to someone just hired to dust shelves. The boy listened like he was learning more than just math. He was learning perspective. Jonathan froze in disbelief. For years he had surrounded his child with private tutors, elite schools, and polished etiquette. Yet here was his maid doing what all that money never could, connecting. He didn't interrupt, not yet. He just stood there, hidden behind the doorframe, watching. He didn't know it then, but that small moment, that lesson by the fire, would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about education, race, and worth. That evening changed something in Jonathan, though he didn't admit it. He told no one what he saw. Instead, he watched quietly from a distance, noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Grace, the maid, arrived early every morning long before sunrise. She prepared breakfast, arranged the dining room, and made sure the house gleamed before anyone else woke up. But now there was something more in her routine, time she spent with Ethan. At first, Jonathan assumed it was harmless. Maybe she was just keeping the boy busy until the tutor arrived. But soon he realized the tutor hadn't been called for weeks. Ethan insisted that Miss Grace teaches better. It stung his pride, or a billionaire's son being taught by his maid. Yet when Jonathan overheard one of their lessons, he couldn't help but listen. Grace didn't just teach numbers. She taught meaning. Every equation, she told Ethan, is about balance. Just like people, when one side takes too much, the other falls apart. Those words echoed in Jonathan's mind long after he left the hallway. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't name. Discomfort, maybe shame. A few days later, at a charity event, he found himself surrounded by men in suits discussing social progress and equality. Words they threw around like decorations, never meaning a thing. And as Jonathan smiled politely, he saw Grace's reflection in his thoughts, standing by a whiteboard in a maid's uniform, teaching his son about balance. That night, he returned home earlier than usual. He wanted to see the lesson again, but when he opened the study door, the scene was different. Ethan was reading aloud from a history book, the story of Frederick Douglass, while Grace listened, encouraging him to think deeper. "Why do you think people treated him that way?" she asked softly. "Because of his skin?" Ethan said, hesitating. Grace nodded. "And what should we do when the world says someone is worth less?" Ethan's answer was simple. "Prove them wrong." Jonathan's chest tightened. It wasn't anger, it was realization. This woman who had been invisible in his world was giving his son the one thing money could never buy: humanity. But the moment didn't last. The next morning, Mrs. Langford found out. A servant whispered, gossip spread like smoke, and when she confronted Grace in the kitchen, the air turned cold. "You're paid to clean," she said sharply, her voice slicing through the tension. "Not to educate my child." Grace's hands trembled, but her eyes stayed steady. "Ma'am, I was only helping him learn." "Learn?" Mrs. Langford scoffed. "Don't pretend you belong in our world. The words hit harder than any slap. Jonathan stood in the doorway, silent, torn between pride, shame, and a truth he could no longer ignore. What began as an innocent act of kindness had now turned into a quiet storm, brewing inside the mansion. And as the walls of privilege began to crack, one question hung heavy in the air. Would Jonathan defend the woman his world told him to ignore? Or protect the image he'd built his life upon? The next morning the house felt colder than ever. Grace worked silently, her eyes avoiding everyone's. The air was heavy with judgment, whispered words, sharp glances, unspoken blame. Ethan, confused and hurt, refused to eat his breakfast. Jonathan sat at the table, pretending to read the paper, but every word blurred behind his guilt. When he heard raised voices from the study, he rushed in. His wife stood there, pointing at Grace, who held Ethan protectively by the shoulder. "I told you to stay away from my son," Mrs. Langford shouted. "You've crossed the line." Grace didn't argue. She just lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean any harm." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "She's not bad, Mom. She helps me learn." "Enough," Mrs. Langford snapped. "Go to your room." Jonathan's throat tightened. He could feel his world splitting in two, one side built on his wealth, image, and pride, the other on a truth he could no longer deny. Grace turned to leave quietly, her steps light but her dignity heavy. She reached for the doorknob when Jonathan spoke, his voice low but steady. "Wait," everyone froze. The billionaire who never questioned anything finally did. "You were wrong," he said, looking at his wife. "She wasn't crossing a line, she was showing us one." Mrs. Langford's face hardened. "Jonathan," but he didn't stop. "I watched her teach our son more than any school ever did. Not just math, not history, values. Things we forgot to give him." Grace stood motionless, tears glimmering but unshed. Ethan ran to her, holding her tightly. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. For the first time in that mansion, truth spoke louder than money. Jonathan knew the consequences, the gossip, the headlines, the whispers among his friends. But he also knew that doing nothing would be far worse. He turned to Grace. "You're not just our maid. You're part of this house. If you'll stay." Her eyes met his, filled with disbelief, pain, and gratitude all at once. That moment, raw, fragile, and brave, would change them all forever. The mansion felt different after that day. The silence that once represented status now carried meaning. Conversations became softer. Meals weren't about formality anymore. They were about connection. Grace stayed, not as the maid, but as something far more important, a teacher, a mentor, a friend. Ethan's lessons became their shared routine, but now Jonathan often joined too, sitting quietly in the corner, listening as his son and Grace explored ideas that went beyond textbooks. One evening, Ethan asked a question that made Jonathan pause. "Dad, were you ever wrong about people?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "Every day, son. But the difference is, and I'm learning, outside the world remained the same hierarchy, the same quiet injustices. But inside that mansion, something fundamental had shifted." Jonathan began funding education programs in underprivileged communities quietly, without his name attached. He didn't do it for image this time. He did it for balance, the very thing Grace once taught his son. As for Grace, she continued teaching, not just in that house but in many others, inspiring children who reminded her of herself, bright, overlooked, and full of potential. Years later, when Ethan graduated, he didn't thank his father's money or his elite school. Standing on stage, he said, "I owe my education to someone who saw me not as a name but as a mind, someone who taught me that knowledge has no color and kindness has no class." The audience fell silent. Jonathan's eyes welled with tears, not of guilt but of pride. Sometimes change doesn't start with protests or speeches. Sometimes it begins in a single room with a lesson, a voice, and the courage to listen. So if this story touched your heart, don't just move on, share it. Let it remind you that equality isn't just a word, it's a choice. And if you believe in stories that make the world think differently, subscribe now, because we tell the truths many choose to ignore.